The narrative about Baloch society suffers from a great deal of misunderstanding and lack of understanding of Baloch tribal society. Tribal societies are not something that, drop down from the heavens or pop out of the woodwork suddenly. They are historically evolved forms of society, usually societies that do not make the transition from pastoral nomadism to settled cultivation are societies where tribal structures continue far longer than anywhere else. And that is probably one of the explanations, if not the explanation, for the continuance of tribal society in places like Balochistan and even amongst the Pashtuns in certain areas. So it is a historically evolved form, structure, conforming to the level of development, economic, social, etc., of that society. On the other hand, the reason for its continuance long after tribal society has been either nibbled away or has crumbled or has made a transition to settled agriculture and historically a higher form of society which can lead to urbanization and urban civilization also. Well, the reason for the continuance or the lingering is because the conditions, economic and other, are such that that transition is difficult. What do I mean? Take the case of Balochistan. It is, as I've told you before, semi-arid, desert and bare mountain. When I say bare mountain, it's rocky mountains without much vegetation. Now this is very different from some areas, for example, of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa or Fata, where there are, of course, bare mountains too, but there are also mountains that have a lot of foliage, greenery, forests, etc. It's the climatic difference. Okay? As I've said, the Balochistan area is a continuation geologically of the Iranian plateau, which again is semi-arid, desert and bare mountains. So the topography is the same on both sides of that border. Now, historically, when the Baloch migrated to this part of the subcontinent, they were already pastoral nomads, relying on livestock as a way of life. When they settled in this area, the conditions did not alarm them or discourage them. In fact, they were very familiar with such conditions because that was their way of life. So they settled in this area in the same pattern, nomadic pastoralists. That has continued. Why has it continued? Okay. The Baloch community in what is today Pakistan didn't emerge as a politically unified entity until the 18th century, which is the emergence of the Kalat state. The Kalat state was surrounded by stronger empires and often was a tributary state, whether to Kabul or Iran. Nevertheless, it was also an internally confederal tribal state, meaning the tribes were autonomous. They gave the Khan of Kalat, who was the head of the Kalat state, nominal suzerainty, but not total. And so although he was the head of the state, it was not a state in the modern sense that we understand it. It was a tribal confederacy. The tribes retained their autonomy, verging on independence, and yet owed nominal suzerainty to the Khan. This is the state that the British encountered in Balochistan in their strategic thrust towards Afghanistan when they were vying with Tsarist Russia for influence in this area. They were not so much interested in the relatively poorly developed, arid, semi-arid, bare, desert, rocky mountain place called Balochistan. They were interested in a strategic route via Kandahar. And so whatever military campaigns they fought in the 19th century and didn't quite succeed in quelling the Baloch resistance, finally came to the conclusion in the latter half of the 19th century that it's far better to have an accommodation with these people, because we're not really after their lands, we're not after their livestock, we don't want to take over physically Balochistan because there's hardly anything there, it's not worth the effort. But certainly if we can get an accommodation with them which serves our purpose of a strategic route for Afghanistan, that's good enough. And with that limited goal, they entered into negotiations. I think 1876 is the last war, if I'm not mistaken. And they did come to treaty agreements whereby they acquired the rights of the strategic corridor, which runs from Shikarpur in Sindh through Jacobabad, Sibbi, through the Bolan Pass, what is today Quetta, Chaman, and into Kandahar. And the areas they occupied along the strategic route came to be known later as British Balochistan because they administered these areas. Whereas the rest of Balochistan was not British Balochistan, it was the tribes and the Kalat state. So this uneasy arrangement continued from the latter half or latter quarter, I would say, of the 19th century up to the time the British left, 1947. It's not as though it was all hunky-dory from there on. The British did have problems with the tribes from time to time, just as they did with the Pashtun tribes. But nevertheless, this system, known as the Sandeman system, after a British civil servant, is the framework in which the British dealt with the Baloch. So the Khan had purses, the Sardars had purses, and they offered the setting up of a paramilitary force from the tribes, recruited from the tribes, called levies, which operated within their own tribal area, paid for by the British. They still exist, even in the state of Pakistan. And guarantees that the internal autonomy of the tribes and the nominal suzerainty of the Kalat state over Balochistan would not be disturbed. So a kind of compromise and an agreement that served the strategic interests of the British, which is all they were interested in having, and also maintained at least the semblance of facade of a Kalat state. Along this strategic corridor, when they reached the Shal Valley, which is the gateway to Chaman and then Kandahar, they found a small village there. And they set up a cantonment. And that is the embryonic beginnings of the city of Quetta. It was always a cantonment city. And to a very great extent it still is, even after independence. So that was what Pakistan inherited. And that is more or less what has continued, even in Pakistan. Now, as to the tribal structure and what is the role of the Sardar in it, this needs understanding. Anthropologists have done studies on the Baloch tribes, or some of the Baloch tribes. And their findings are, I think, a more accurate reflection of the situation rather than political propaganda. They found that although the Sardar had considerable power over his tribe, it was not an absolute power. It was a power mitigated or limited by what they call rivaj. Rivaj is custom. Customary practice and customary law, therefore, is the legitimizing principle of the tribal Sardar system. So the Sardar in Baloch tribal society is not simply the, absolute powerful oppressor as he is painted sometimes. He serves a function in the structure and life of the tribe. Now what is that function? First and foremost, it is judicial. As I said, neither the Kalat state nor the tribal structures are in the shape of what we are accustomed to seeing in a modern state. So you don't have courts. What you have is adjudication by the Sardar. I mean, he is the highest judicial authority, if you like, in the tribe. So when people come to him with conflicts, disagreements, cases, grievances, he holds court. And in order to hold court, he has to host the litigants. So he not only serves the function of the highest, if you like, judicial forum in a tribe, he also has, therefore, and stemming from that function, to host the litigants, and they can be considerable at any given time. Now, therefore, he requires some means to sustain this. What are the means? Now, I'm getting into the economics of the tribal structure. What are the means? He can have, of course, his own land, which is cultivated. To the extent that cultivation exists in Balochistan, it is marginal. Okay? There is comparatively little irrigated land, which is basically along the Pat, Nasirabad district. The rest of Balochistan, by and large, cultivation is what we call barani or rain-fed, okay, which is seasonal and precarious. Cultivation or agriculture is marginal in that society. So he may have some land from where he derives some income in the tribal area. He may have livestock, which is, an asset in that society, a form of wealth. And then what he gets from the tribe, and this is by agreement, not by force, is some percentage of the income of the tribe in order to fulfill this function, the judicial function. So it's a tithe paid voluntarily by the tribe in order to sustain this system, which is a need of the tribe, because otherwise they'll be fighting each other till kingdom come and nothing will ever get adjudicated. So this is one very important function. Now with it, of course, comes the necessity at times to enforce the verdicts. If litigants come to the sardar and he gives a judgment and one or other of the parties refuses to implement it, whether then or later, then some form of enforcement or punishment, fine and worse, some imposition has to be done. And that is where it's not simply the sardar who does it, it's the tribe that does it. So for instance, if a punitive lashkar has to be formed, it won't be at the whim or the fancy of the sardar. It will be because a judicial verdict is being violated. Okay? So this is one aspect. The other aspect is welfare, which not many people are aware of. If a member of the tribe or a family or a clan or a section is in trouble, where will they turn? Not to the state, because they have no relationship with the state. They turn to the sardar. So there are many instances in which the sardar will feel that he has to help out materially or in other ways. Okay? And last, but by no means least, the sardar is the ultimate sanctuary for people who are in conflict within the tribe and seek to escape out of fear of life or limb from the situation they may be in. And that sometimes includes, often includes, women. When women, for example, are accused of some violation of the tribal code, including what they call karokari, which is adultery, and the woman feels she is unjustly accused. If she feels she is justly accused, by the way, tribal culture, rivaj and custom would seem to impose on her the need to die at the hands of her husband or whoever, close relative. And they will accept that fate. The culture is such that adultery is entered into knowing the risks. Lover and woman will be killed, and it will be justified in that culture. because it's a violation of the code. Now, if a woman feels unjustly accused and seeks sanctuary and refuge, where will she turn? The sardar. So you can see that this is not a structure imposed from above and therefore entirely oppressive. It is an evolution in tribal society, and it is thousands of years old, man. It hasn't happened today. Now, when you confront this kind of situation, and this started in Bhutto's time in the 70s, when he launched his military operation in Balochistan, he painted the situation as though it is the sardars who are resisting modernization and development, and hence the state has had to launch this military operation. Whereas the truth was very different. What was the truth? The truth was Bhutto's penchant, despite his concessions after the 71 debacle to the opposition to form governments in Balochistan and what was then NWFP, his penchant to reverse that and dominate everything in sight. That was Bhutto's temperament, personality and character. So topple governments and impose your own. And back it up with military force if needed, which in Balochistan's case it was. Now, in the pursuit of that objective, Bhutto painted the sardars as oppressive and nothing else, and the greatest obstacle to modernization and development. But what were the facts? At the moment of the launching of the 73 military campaign by Bhutto, there were, if memory serves, 104 sardars in Balochistan. 4 were with the resistance, 100 were with Bhutto's federal government. So, I mean, it falls flat on the facts, this assertion. Okay, number one. Number two, the 4 who were with the resistance, why were they resisting so-called development? Because the development that Mr. Bhutto was speaking of, and by the way, this narrative has continued since. So, since Mr. Bhutto was the author of it, I keep referring to him. It was entirely military, strategic, and counterinsurgency oriented. So, for example, if a road had to be built through tribal territory, which previously didn't have such an all-weather road, it was meant to be able to transport the military into that area to quell the insurgency. That was resisted. That's one aspect. The other aspect, of course, is the desire to exploit the mineral, gas and oil wealth of Balochistan, as had happened with Sui, without adequately giving a share to the people of Balochistan or the people of that area. That too was resisted. So oil exploration, for example, was resisted and is resisted. Development, which I do not think, I've yet to meet a Baloch who didn't want development for himself and for his people. But their insistence is it should not be an exploitative development based either on counterinsurgency needs or deprivation of the rights of the Baloch. Now there is room here for convergence if the perception of that development and the fact of that development were to change in the direction away from counterinsurgency and away from the sheer exploitation of mineral resources, natural resources, that has been the case in the past. I cannot rule out that there are cases where that happens. But I think what I know of Baloch society, it is usually unsustainable. During the 1958 to 1969 war in Balochistan, the Zeri tribe, its chief was deposed by Ayub Khan. And in his place, a collaborator called Doda Khan Zarakzai, which is a clan of the Zeri tribe, was imposed. within I think 2 or 3 years, I can't remember the exact figure, Doda Khan Zarakzai was assassinated by the Zahri tribe. End of story. I'm trying to give you an example of how an imposition, either externally imposed or internally expanded beyond Rivaj, will evoke a reaction from the tribe. In the 70s insurgency, the Mari tribe, which is divided into 3 sections, and the largest is the Bijrani. The Sardar Khel is the Gazani, and a smaller section is the Loharani. The Sardar had differences with some of the leaders drawn from the Bijrani section. There was a split. The Bijranis turned against the Sardar and therefore against the Ghazanis. And today, I think it is indisputable that Nawab Khairbakhsh Mari over the years had lost the kind of control over the Mari tribe, especially the Bijrani section, that he enjoyed traditionally, and that his son, who is inherited after his death, will not enjoy that same power. Here is the largest tribe in Balochistan and the one that has been involved in every insurgency in Pakistan's history virtually, and is the mainstay of the nationalist insurgents. In that tribe, the Nawab or the tribal Sardar could not take it for granted that loyalty to him would be automatic. I am pointing out these examples to indicate to you that it is not the kind of autocratic structure from the top that a lot of people paint it to be. And these are largely uninformed people. The anthropological studies and books on Baloch tribal structure are worth a read in order to understand. Why am I making all this argument? I'll tell you. Bhutto announced when he launched the 73 military repression, in one stroke, the abolition of the Sardari system, as he called it. And what was missing in that narrative was that there was no such thing as a Sardari system. There was a tribal system, of which the Sardar was the apex of every tribe, as I've tried to explain. It meant nothing. Because a tribal structure that has evolved through thousands of years and adopted its own ways and means of ordering its affairs, including basing its structures and its practices on rivaj or tradition, precedent. When you say, I have abolished Sardari, what have you abolished? Have you abolished the tribal system? You cannot abolish a tribal system that is thousands of years of evolution. The only way you can change that society, if that's what you're trying to say, is from within, is from evolution from within. If the tribes acquire a different way of life to their traditional, are offered the facilities that modern states can offer, including education, health, and all the other, employment and so on and so forth, and perhaps even a massive reformation in the economy towards settled agriculture and cultivation if water can be found. That's an evolutionary process. It's not something that can be done with one stroke of the pen or by fiat. That is where Mr. Bhutto misled the country. And proof of that pudding is, long after the 73 declaration of the abolition of Sardari, has it disappeared? Today there are still Sardars in Balochistan. Why is that? When the system so-called has been abolished. That is proof of what I am trying to say. It is tribal structure of which the Sardar is a part that cannot be abolished in this manner. It can only evolve. Now, why do I say it can evolve? Let's get into that. I mentioned earlier that Makran is different from the rest of Balochistan. Why is it different? It's different for two, I think, very important historical reasons. One is that it is not necessarily at the center of things, even in the Kalat Confederacy, in the same way quite as Kalat itself and as the Mari Bukti and Jalawan tribes were. It's in some senses a peripheral area, okay? And on the other hand, it is also a coastal area. What does that imply? It implies interaction with the outside world. Tribes in the internal mountains would tend to be insular, cut off from the rest of the world. Peripheral, therefore, in that sense. But Makran, because of its coast, was always a seafaring, fishing, trading area. And trade is the greatest lubricant for interaction with the outside world known to history and man. Civilizations through the millennia that you read about, you read about their interaction with their contemporary world. As long ago as the Indus Valley civilization, there were three major ancient civilizations: Indus, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. And all three traded with each other by sea. And their artifacts, archaeological finds have indicated that. So this is as old as man, is what I'm trying to suggest. And Makran, for geographical reasons, was open to that. And the biggest interaction, by the way, historically that Makran had was with Oman across the Gulf. It is not an accident, therefore, there's a long relationship. It is not an accident, therefore, that the king of Oman bought Gwadar. He owned Gwadar until 1958, when Pakistan bought it off him again. Not many people are aware of this. This relationship, interaction between Oman and Makran is very old. Trade and many other things. And that is the reason Oman's army has a huge number of soldiers recruited as mercenaries from Makran. When they were facing an insurgency by Marxist guerrillas, that was at an even higher level. But even now, when that insurgency has been crushed, every year Omani officers arrive in Makran to recruit local people for their army. And why do they lend themselves to this, you might ask? Because it's employment. Why, after all, in colonial times, did local inhabitants go into the British East India Company's army and later the British Crown's army? It's employment. Okay? So the same pattern applies. Now, the implication of what I'm saying about Makran, it's open door, a gateway to the world, implied that it was not as insular or hidebound as, say, a tribe sitting on some mountaintop in the middle of nowhere, with no communication, no infrastructure to interact with anybody else. Local maybe, but not wider. The result of that is that the Makran tribal structure has begun to crumble, if it has not crumbled already. You will not find the same tribal structure in Makran as you will, say, in the Mari Bukti, or even in Jalawan or Sarawan, you see. So what I'm trying to suggest is that when I say tribal society, I'm not talking of an absolute. I'm talking of a certain stage of historical evolution. And if we believe that it came through historical evolution, then in principle, there's no reason why it can't go further. But it has to be an internal process. And it has to be a process that comes from below, is not imposed from above. Imposition from above has not worked in the past, has been seen as repression, has been seen as evil, has been seen as an agenda which has nothing to do with the welfare of the people, has more to do with repressive and extractive practices. Hence, when you try to, in one stroke abolish so-called sardari system or impose on the tribes an external regime, it will be resisted. The tribes will circle the wagons and will resist by force of arms. This is history, this is the track record, this is the consistent pattern. Now, if we understand this, then force is not going to change that society. If anything, the use of force and repression and imposition from above will strengthen the continuance of that society at that stage of historical evolution, because it feels under attack. And the only defense it has when it is under attack is to rely on its traditional structures and ways of doing things. This is the argument. Now, if only the state of Pakistan would understand this. Things have happened in Balochistan. It's not as though it's standing still. No place is standing still. Education has arrived, even higher education, university. That has produced, over the years, a middle class. Now, for instance, when I edit my paper, The Daily Times, I find a lot of letters and some articles written by people from places in Balochistan that you've never even heard of. Now, where are these people coming from? Writing in English? What's going on? Something is changing. There's a dynamic in that society. If only we would be aware of it and sensitive to it. That's a natural evolution. Nobody's brought that about by an imposition. It's emerged from within that society. The facilitation is there, but it's emerged. That middle class in Balochistan today is a relatively bigger and newer phenomenon than we have seen in the past. It was a very small middle class before. It's grown. So my argument is, allow that society to evolve further from tribal society democratically, by facilitating it, by giving it the wherewithal, by giving it the opportunity, by giving it the necessary means, and then see what happens. And in the process, stop crushing them, trying to crush them, take them on board,